Well, thanks everyone for joining. We know there's going to be new folks joining over time, but I just want to welcome those of you who are attending our event for the first time, and for those who may have joined one of the meetup groups. Very pleased to have Michael Grant and Brian Asingia. Very pleased that they're going to be giving to us. What I have to say is I'm very looking forward to this event because ethics and technology is a topic that we've yet to cover, I think, over the past 4.5 years since we started. And I think the timing couldn't really be better, while at the same time, we also need to be looking at the innovation and the opportunities to actually leverage the technology to meet some of the challenges, both at the business and societal level. So it does give me great pleasure to introduce both Michael and Brian, and looking forward to an event. Just to let you know, there will be opportunity for participants to ask questions as and when Michael and Brian go through their material. So do bear with us, and perhaps if you have a question, Michael and Brian, I'm sure we'll be able to give you an opportunity to raise a question. So with that said, Michael, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good day. I just want to confirm that you're all seeing the content that I'm sharing.
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm Michael Grant. It's my great pleasure to be here today to talk about how banks, financial services, and insurance companies can prepare to compete in the modern business environment. So we will look at what we need to compete and win, what we have today, and two technologies we can utilize to bridge that gap and to give customers the experiences that they expect and demand. So I just want to mention briefly that we're recording this presentation so that people can have access to it in the future, and so we can share the recording to anyone who would like to see it. And we'll start with a few observations about what we can learn from the last 20 years. 7 out of the 10 most highly valued companies today are internet companies with data-driven business models. Out of those 7 companies, 5 of them are just over 20 years old. So how did these companies that started just 20 years ago become so dominant so quickly? Ming Zhang, the chairman of the academic council of the Alibaba Group, says these companies have succeeded so quickly because they're able to harness data from a variety of sources, from customers, from suppliers, from shippers, from internal databases. And this data moves seamlessly throughout an ecosystem that includes all internal and external stakeholders, all of whom are connected to each other. This data ecosystem allows these companies to make decisions immediately, in real time, without requiring human intervention. He calls this smart business. Alibaba connects all of the functions you would associate with retail and coordinates them into a connected economy: sellers, marketers, shipping companies, manufacturers, and of course, buyers. Algorithms make sense of all that data and make dynamic, real-time decisions. Now, a great example of the connected digital ecosystem is Uber. I'm sure every one of us has taken an Uber at some point, so we've all seen this in action. Every stakeholder is connected, all of the drivers and the locations of their cars, the customer, multiple customers and their locations if you're ride sharing, third-party data sources like GPS and traffic, right? All of this data is connected on the same platform, and all of the decisions are made by an algorithm without human intervention. I mean, this is Ming Zhang's definition of smart business, clearly demonstrated. Now compare that with the taxi business, where all of the touch points between the stakeholders are manual, right? Customers call the company and give their location to a dispatcher. The dispatcher contacts the drivers by radio and learns their locations and availability. Then the dispatcher decides who will pick up the customer. All right, the customer doesn't know where the driver is, so she doesn't know how long it'll take for the car to come. All right, you see some flat rate pricing for trips from the airport, but mostly the pricing is based on the meter. So the customer doesn't know what it'll cost until the ride's over. And the only way to give feedback is to write down the driver's permit number and lodge a complaint. It's the same series of steps, but it's all manual, which slows the process and delivers a less satisfying experience to the customer. Now, I live in New York City. Taxis are part of the culture, but for the last 5 years, taxi trips are declining while Uber and Lyft rides are increasing. You need a taxi medallion to drive a cab in New York. All right, there are only 13,000 of these medallions by law. So if you have one, you have a valuable commodity. In 2014, they sold for $1.3 million each. Today, they sell for about $150,000. Now, these 21st century companies, 5 of the 10 most valuable companies in the world are digital natives. They were built from the ground up to follow the smart business model. They do not have any legacy issues because they're not old enough to have them. But what if your company does not have the luxury of being born in the 21st century? You came of age in a different time. You made investments in core technologies before the advent of microservices. You built your processes around manual touch points. You're following business models that are decades, if not hundreds of years old, and you're heavily regulated. I mean, the UCP for trade finance was established in 1933. You employ scores of people to service customers personally via telephone and email and in the office. And then you bought a pricey ticketing system for them to key in information about these customer interactions. Right, so the terms digital native and digital immigrant were originally coined to describe people who were born, before or after the onset of the digital age, but they could just as easily be applied to businesses. And when your business models and your core technologies were built for a different time, you have to change both of them to compete. And isn't that a great definition for digital transformation? I mean, everyone is being pushed to update how they do business because we're in the midst of the 4th industrial revolution. All right, so the first one was powered by steam, gave us mechanization. Second one was powered by electricity, gave us mass production. The third one was powered by microchips and compute power, and it gave us our digital world and the internet. The 4th industrial revolution is described as the advent of cyber-physical systems that connect the physical, digital, and biological worlds. Now, we could take an hour just to unpack that sentence, right? But the point for today is that all of these connections require data. They generate data. Where once you could, only manually input data into computer screens, which, limited by definition the amount, right? Now, the Internet of Things connect a data stream from inanimate objects into this digital ecosystem. And medical devices like a Fitbit connect the biological world to this digital ecosystem. Right? Computers can process all of those data streams in real time. Algorithms can make decisions based on the data. Blockchain can record all the transactions. I mean, with 3D printers, even matter is digitized. So the implications for business models are staggering. Now, that's an enormous topic, much too big for us to tackle. But now that we've looked at this broader context, we can narrow the focus to look at 2 of the larger challenges faced by digital immigrant companies today, and 2 of the technologies that can help overcome those challenges. The goal is that smart business, right, where data flows without barriers and decisions are made dynamically without human intervention. In healthcare, they talk about interoperability. How can you get patient data flowing between all the different stakeholders, right? The patient, the doctors, the labs, the pharmacies, the insurance companies, the Medicare system. The chart on the right envisions what that could look like for banks. Right? Imagine a smart business ecosystem where banks have open platforms on which third-party developers and fintech startups can quickly design new products to deliver the great customer experiences that people want. If the big banks can move quickly enough, they'll sit at the heart of this ecosystem. Banks own the customer base, the assets, the distribution systems. So with an open API economy, fintechs could develop their digital products on these bank ecosystems, coexisting rather than competing. And banks are fully committed to this process. The work is already underway. Right? But it's not easy to take hundreds of internal services and redesign them as REST APIs. It's costly, time consuming. And in the meantime, Fintechs might decide to federate around a set of their own APIs. Right? Or a new player like Amazon could simply expand what they're already doing with payments and lending and disrupt the entire market. So time is not an ally for venerable companies trying to remain competitive. And the question is, well, how do you get to smart business from where you are today? And there are two big barriers that venerable companies most overcome. One of them is unstructured data. Unstructured data is data that's not in the correct format to enter this digital ecosystem. So this is your call center staff opening emails and then keying data into the ticketing system. It's your accounts payable people receiving invoices and then keying the data into the AP system. In insurance, this is where claims representatives manually process accident reports and repair estimates. For banks, right, the future of trade finance is blockchain-based networks, but that's years away. So right now, you're verifying conditions manually. That gives you high error rates and operational risk. Right? Paper and text files sit at the heart of many processes for banks, financial services, and insurance companies. And until those documents can be reliably read and digitized, these processes will remain manual and inefficient. Right? The other barrier faced by financial companies is their own core systems. Right? Before there was any concept of microservices and smart business, the prevailing wisdom was to create large software systems to perform the core operations of the company. Right? For example, banks replaced manual ledgers with software that handled all the transactions, stored them in a huge database. And the results were revolutionary at the time. But the problem is that these systems are so large in scale and so rich in their functionality that they're too big to adapt easily to change, and they're too expensive to easily replace. And as I said, banks are hard at work trying to reinvent these systems into a series of microservices, but that takes time, a lot of time and a lot of effort. So the challenge is to bring these legacy core systems and unstructured data sources into the digital ecosystem now. I mean, companies like Netflix, Amazon, Airbnb, Stripe, they all prove that the market waits for no one, and a better customer experience can create huge shifts in market share. So how do you take the systems you have today and get this data flowing without having to rewrite all the code? Well, there's two major technologies that'll help you accomplish that. Robotic Process Automation and cognitive machine reading. Robotic Process Automation enables legacy computer systems that are unable to natively integrate to join the digital ecosystem. Cognitive machine reading takes the data that's contained in various unstructured sources, emails, forms, contracts, letters of credit, pay stubs, and digitizes that data so it can start driving decisions. The best way to think about these technologies is to examine how they can contribute to data's journey through your organization. Can you bring in all of your internal and external stakeholders into the digital ecosystem? It's easy if the data starts life in the correct format, right? Like with Uber, everything starts with the app. Or an upstart insurance company like Lemonade, right? Customers apply, buy, file claims online, right? There's only one channel to support. They are the only broker. But when you support multiple channels and you have paper-driven processes and there are handwritten forms and different document types, you have to digitize that data before you can make it available for processing. That means automatically reading emails and understanding what they say, reading documents and pulling the key data from them, like extracting customer data from a loan application. But once you've made data available, then you have to make it usable. And this is where you use AI to do natural language modeling and analyze the meaning of language in these documents, the words, the grammar, the context. You can detect the sentiment of a support request to judge the priority. You can find key concepts in contracts, like references to LIBOR, so you can understand your exposure and begin to repaper all of those agreements. You can read a pension agreement to look for references to a spouse to determine a person's marital status. Right? But once the data has been cleaned and curated, it is ready then to be used to power some decision or to trigger some action. And that's when you make it mobile and let the data enter the ecosystem. Now, where there are native APIs, you can just simply export the document data in the correct JSON schema. But when you have downstream systems that cannot integrate programmatically, you can use RPA to integrate via the user interface. Now, what does that mean, to integrate via the user interface? Well, wherever you have business systems that cannot talk to each other, you have humans acting as the glue between those systems. They're called swivel chair employees. The problem is that humans interrupt the flow of data. Right? Smart business is about data driving decisions without human intervention. So robotic process automation will replace the human as the glue between those systems. Right? RPA will log into the legacy system and execute the same mouse clicks and keystrokes a human would to enter the data. And since every computer is designed to present a user interface, anything from an AS400 green screen, right, to the latest enterprise application is now able to join the digital ecosystem. Right, for example, there are APIs available to check the various sanction lists and database. But many banks still have staff checking websites manually, which makes the account opening process inefficient. Right, so the ultimate solution is to just integrate with risk intelligence services via APIs. But until then, intelligent automation, right, combining RPA and cognitive machine reading, will allow banks today, right, to conduct their customer identification programs with a digital workforce that they directly control, that follows procedures exactly, that is onshore, that doesn't have to quarantine, that works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and leaves behind a complete audit trail of their work. I mean, banks have been offshoring this work for years to reduce costs, but a digital workforce is even less is a less expensive source of labor, and it's more compliant. Here's an example. Cognitive machine reading technology could read emails or texts or have chatbot conversations about fraudulent debit card charges. So fraud reporting could be done without any human intervention. Customers could just complete an online form. But as of today, banks still prefer these conversations to happen by telephone, which is fine. But that does not mean that the whole transaction has to be manual. The customer service rep could be filling out the online form during the customer call, right? Gathering, entering the required information, the customer details, the account number, the transaction date, the payer, the amount, and once that information is entered once, the rest of the work, right? Everything you see there in green can be automated, right? RPA could log into those various systems and execute that work, freeing the customer service rep to go and help more people. It takes about 20 minutes for a consumer loan officer to handle an application from a prospective borrower. The loan officer, let's call him John since my graphic seems to be male. John needs to copy and paste information between emails. Multiple loan processing systems, credit bureaus, several government websites. It's difficult, demanding, time-consuming, and tedious work. Since his data takes about 20 minutes, John can process 3 loans per hour, and most of that time is spent cutting and pasting data. Now, imagine if a digital worker did all of those steps, validates the appraisal, does the credit checks, enters the credit score into the system. That would free up John from the data entry and let him focus on just the loans that require his judgment. To take it a step further, you could allow the customer to submit that information him or herself. The loan processing system might not be modern enough to give the customer direct access to it, but cognitive machine reading could act as the go-between, extracting the information from an application document or an email, and then giving the data to a digital worker to key it into the loan processing system. Now, that smart business connection is achieved because the information flows from the customer directly without any human intervention in between. And if the credit score and income have a certain ratio, the algorithm could approve the loan and the entire process could be automated. Right, so our friend John is not only freed up from the data entry, he also doesn't even have to review the loans that have the right debt to income ratio and the right credit score, because the algorithm will approve those automatically. Now John can just focus his time on the borderline loans that require his judgment. The combination of cognitive machine reading and RPA can help you become a smart business rapidly. Right? Intelligent automation doesn't change your core systems. It's a lightweight layer that sits on top of these systems. It's looking to solve the same problems that an API integration would, but it's doing it in a different way to create communications bridges between incompatible systems. You can deploy an automation in 1/10 of the time and for about 1/10 of the cost of a traditional IT upgrade. So this flexibility allows companies to take an iterative, agile approach to transforming their business models. This creates strategic flexibility for IT departments to squeeze significant value from legacy systems by extending their usefulness. This also allows companies to execute a digital strategy. So now they can engage customers online, with automation acting as the bridge between legacy systems and that online experience. Right, this chart shows a number of well-established use cases for financial services companies. Right, so the left column lists the various capabilities brought to bear by a fully featured intelligent automation solution, and the top row shows the different use cases. And so if you look at the financial spreading column on the far right, you'll see, the handwriting columns are left blank because financial reports are typically printed, but almost everything else is checked. Right? Pre-processing to enhance the machine readability of a document, document identification to understand what it is and what data is relevant to extract, natural language processing to understand what's being read in many different languages, machine learning to continually improve the results, enriching the data to apply context, and then making that clean data mobile either via APIs or RPA. Right? There's no time to waste because disruption comes quickly. Right? Peter Nanterme, a CEO of Accenture, laid down the gauntlet while speaking at the 2016 World Economic Forum. He said, digital is the main reason just over half the companies on the Fortune 500 have disappeared since the year 2000. The accelerated pace of the digital decades has led to estimates that the scope of change seen in a single year now equates to that experienced in 7 years during the pre-digital era. So we're all aging in dog years now, right? So hopefully I've shown you how you can apply these technologies today to help modernize your business processes and deliver competitive customer experiences with your legacy infrastructures. And of course, when we create algorithms to make our decisions, we must make absolutely certain that they're fair and free from bias. Klaus Schwab is the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. He literally wrote the book on the fourth industrial revolution, and he warns that technology is advancing so quickly that it could outpace society's ability to control it. Governments have historically been slow to adapt to technology, and as we've discussed today, businesses and individuals also struggle to keep up with the pace of change. AI has immense power to create immense wealth, but Klaus Schwab says that leaders and citizens must together shape a future that works for all by putting people first, empowering them, and constantly reminding ourselves that all of these new technologies are first and foremost tools made by people for people. A laissez-faire approach runs the risk of this immense power creating inequality and social injustice. We could wind up with a winner-take-all economy where highly skilled workers prosper and the rest are left behind. If you think privacy is an issue today, right, imagine what it would look like when your genetics are used to customize your life insurance. If you think it's creepy that telematics in your car can measure how aggressively you drive and determine your car insurance rates today, then imagine when your biometrics are tracked to customize your life insurance. With IoT generating a data feed about everything you come in contact with every day, privacy could literally cease to exist. So businesses and governments must work together to ensure that AI and all of its transformational power is wielded to lift up all of humanity. And that's a tall order, which is why I'm glad that we have Brian Asingia here to talk about how we must put ethics and values first to ensure that all of these amazing technological advancements work to everyone's benefit. So I'll stop sharing now and hand it over to Brian and see if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Michael. We'll wait for a few seconds, see if there's any questions.
Hi there, Michael. Hi, it's Dennis Swanchi here. Thanks for that presentation. I was really taken by the point you made around adoption, and one of the big challenges is addressing how do you actually make that transformation from the traditional systems we have today, and everyone's going towards microservices and so on and so forth. But the big jump sounds like it's really towards robotic process automation and cognitive machine reading. I don't know very much about cognitive machine reading, and I was wondering, could you just perhaps talk a little bit about what's the biggest barrier to adoption? Because it sounds like that would be a major game changer if once you get it right.
Absolutely. So first, I'll say that I'm not saying that RPA should eclipse microservices and the use of APIs. I'm saying that that RPA is an adjoining tool, and particularly when you're dealing with older processes and legacy technologies, if they're not capable of participating through an API, RPA is a way that allows them to achieve a similar integration. Now, with regard to cognitive machine reading, there's an older technology called optical character recognition. That was really the first layer of technology that companies used to try and read documents, whether they're semi-structured or structured or unstructured. Now, OCR is very good at structured documents and less good at semi-structured, and really struggles with unstructured. And the challenge is that 80% or more of the data in an organization will be unstructured. So unfortunately, letters of credit don't cooperate and all come in the exact same format. Even something as standard as a W-2 is laid out from every different organization differently. So it's not like you can create one OCR template and just read every W-2 form out there. So it's that data variance that makes OCR struggle, and that has been historically a limiting factor on what organizations could achieve digitizing paper-based processes and creating that digital fuel for automation by dealing with data in the first mile. Cognitive machine reading is now an AI fuel technology designed to accomplish the same thing, but in a more modern way. And so as a result, you're applying different cognitive capabilities. You're able now to read documents, deal with that kind of variance. It opens up a lot more use cases, and ultimately you're attacking data in that first mile that today is dark to an organization, but with cognitive machine reading can now take that data and allow it to enter the digital economy.
Fantastic, yeah. And that applies to both structured and unstructured data sets.
That's exactly right.
Exists for that. Thank you, yeah. Okay, I'm not sure if there's any other questions. Just quickly check here. Oh, okay. I do. Yeah, hi, Debbie. Debbie, do you want to ask a question?
Hi, Dennis.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, did you want to pop in something else?
No, I'm fine. Thank you, Gil.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you all very much. This is very interesting, of course, for so many of us. It's possible Brian is going to touch on this already, but the business analyst in me wants to talk about change management. What I've experienced and seen, a prime example is BC Hydro, their smart metering infrastructure project. They've just done a post-op on their business case, and they've recognized that they failed with change management despite having it side by side along from the beginning with the project team. Over-scoping, planning all this huge data and what you can do with it, but then not actually integrating it into, or not actually teaching people that they can use the data both ethically and maybe not so much. That was a big failure, and this is a curiosity of mine, how we can encourage better scoping and awareness that you don't necessarily need that data just because you're collecting it.
Yeah, I can take a first crack on that, and that is that, I mean, you're touching on a very, very significant issue. You know, too many times organizations look at this concept of digitizing older processes as a technology effort. And of course, technology is an important part of it, but it really has to be an organizational wide effort that includes all the different stakeholders, and it has to have an executive oversight, because you know what you're trying to do really is you're trying to take 20th century business models and you're trying to update them for our current business climate, and that's not just a technology issue. And so, as you rightly state, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And if you're going to do something, you really need to understand its implications for your own organization internally, and of course, you know, for what it's going to mean to the end customer. It's a massive undertaking. And if you just focus on the technology and what it can and cannot do, you run the risk of having the overall goals of the project fail. There's a lot to manage.
Completely agree. Thank you.
And yes, I will touch base on it a little bit. So we'll have to wait and see.
Fantastic. Thank you, gentlemen.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry, Brian, over to you. Thanks for answering the question, Michael. Over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Dennis. Just give me a second, everybody, while I load up the presentation, and then we'll get started.
Yep.
I can see your content.
Perfect. That works for everybody?
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. Well, thanks everybody again for joining us today. I know we're living in interesting times. I'd like to thank Michael for having really touched on the really critical technical and implementation aspects, as has been raised by Debbie, as far as how do you actually make this work, right? Like, we understand that there's change happening. We understand that organizations need to adapt and have some digital roadmap that they can start implementing in phases. But where do you start? How do you do it? And who do you get involved in this process? A little bit about me. I'm an electrical and computer engineer by training. I've worked at the New York Stock Exchange and kind of helped, was involved in their earlier automation process. As you know, the exchange actually continued operating even during this COVID-19 lockdown. And that's because they have sort of been ahead of the curve in implementing their business continuity process. And I was fortunate enough to sort of be involved in that process. You know, when you talk about scoping, what are the processes that are critical to the business? Can we do them piecemeal, as opposed to sort of having this big bang approach where you're trying to fix everything at the same time, and then when it doesn't work, people are locked out of the accounts, and then you can't even resolve what the issues are. So being able to plan out that change and carry out the necessary training so that your teams and partners, quite honestly, your customers, are aware that these changes are happening is very important. So the things that I'm going to be touching base on today are an overview on ethics in general in regards to this industry and innovation. I'll touch on what I consider the new normal, and I think Michael has really done a great job in the first half of this series, explaining what that reality looks like and the need for organizations to adapt or die, to put it bluntly. I'll talk about some case studies or begin to look at some real world applications or organizations that are experimenting with this. But the overall point there is for me to expose the challenges, again, as Debbie was able to raise, that if this is not done carefully, you end up creating more problems than solutions. I'll wrap it up, obviously, by sort of highlighting the way forward and how we can integrate this. So there are four main things that I think for me are important in terms of this conversation that we're going to be having. And those four things are identity, ownership, trust, and scale. So identity here, I'm referring to digital identities in the technical sense, the way you authenticate and log into systems. But I'm also talking about the human side of who is your customer or who is your employee, who is actually the human being interacting with this digital interface, whether it's a robot, whether it's a touch screen, whether it's a voice-activated chatbot. Do you understand how they're going to be engaging with this system, right? That has a big impact on the success. A lot of the products being demoed at CES and all these consumer electronic shows were really not as impressive because they haven't been tested on a large subset of the population. So they can work maybe with one accent or they can work with one language, but if you try to sort of take it out of that normal tested environment, it's not yet commercially viable. Ownership becomes critical because, as we'll later see, it impacts the rate of innovation because innovation requires funding, innovation requires both human and financial capital commitments. So that within organizations and even on a governmental level, as we're seeing states, whether it be China, whether it be Taiwan, whether it be even Brazil, Russia, right, having their own AI or blockchain kind of projects on a large scale. You look at 5G being an issue, right? Who owns the technology? Who owns the underlying data? And more importantly, even the transport mechanism, the pipelines that are transporting this information. So that is both on a capital side, you can look at it as an investor perspective, but also I'm talking about the intellectual property. On the trust side, this is where leadership really becomes important, right? So if you're just implementing change, and I've seen this in a lot of organizations where IT is just IT in the corner and business just tells them, oh, we just need this thing to work, right? And there's business is only indicating or issuing a command. They're not providing detail on how legal compliance is supposed to go. They're not providing context on sort of the timeline by when they might need it. I feel like that level of sporadic innovation actually doesn't always work because you need all the parties involved. So you can understand the roles from an identity perspective, as we mentioned. So we can talk about the ownership, who's going to be managing the project, who's going to be moving it through these processes. And then let's talk about operationally, once it's live and launched, who's maintaining it? Who's making, what is the process for updating and improving it to make sure it's still auditable, that it's still compliant? So trust, and as you know, trust both on the technical side, we've seen a lot of data privacy breaches in the last 5 years alone. Zoom, which we're using right now, has just had a major security update on its software to continue to keep its users' trust, even though a lot of organizations are already moving away from it, right? So credibility and trust is also being digitized in some way, but it starts with those human values being implemented. And then we come to the scale component, which again, Michael was able to sort of really explain what that means on an enterprise scale, on a business-to-business scale, where you can have different systems, whether they are legacy, Java or other sort of backend systems that used to just sit in a server in a data center somewhere, to your modern sort of touchscreen ATM that the consumer is actually interacting with when they visit a bank or when they're scheduling their appointment with their local hairdresser, right? These systems more and more have to adapt to the needs of the consumer or the client, and also be reliable. So it's not that it just has to work once and it's great. How do we make sure it's working 24/7? Because the modern consumer or the modern business cannot afford disruption or being offline. So this is where data and AI sort of research and integration, of course in phases, becomes critical for organizations, as well as, and I cannot emphasize this enough, the compliance component that to me becomes the consistent piece here. Compliance should not come at the end. Compliance should always be there from the very beginning, so that you're not fixing problems once you're in millions of homes or you have, lots of countries that have already deployed your solution. So a very quick overview on what's coming up at MIT and Harvard. They have an upcoming emerging technology conference. This is less, it's not a promotion, but this was really me trying to use a current event, a current conversation that's happening to show us what are the issues that organizations and institutions are concerned about, right? There's generally a crisis in terms of innovation and leadership. The kind of technology solutions we're seeing out there they're almost like they have a viral mechanism baked into them, right? Everybody wants to be the first with the solution that works, and they're not taking the time to build it the right way. So you have a lot of privacy concerns that come about once there's mass adoption, once people are actually using the product, and then they rush to fix those things, right? There's no long-term organizational planning. And again, Debbie kind of raised this a little bit, where you can have a business need, and if you don't take the time with your business analysts, with your project managers, with security, with quality assurance to really map out the scope and roadmap for that process, you're not going to design the right solution, right? Protecting organizations from cyber threats or cybersecurity, this continues to be an ongoing trend, while organizations are still not yet digitally resilient against cyber threats. And by the way, with most cybersecurity concerns, the biggest threat is actually human, right? Lack of education, as has already been mentioned. So the more we can train and educate people, there's room to move the needle. And needless to say, remote working, right? The shutdown happened. We're seeing companies like Twitter saying they can now allow their employees to work from home forever, right? Facebook thinks it's going to get to 50% remote work. How are organizations going to adapt to this new normal? The economic outlook doesn't help at all, right? There's not a lot of cash being doled around for big sort of projects or big team retreats to make sure that employees are really trained and are comfortable with these things. So innovation has to happen regardless, and yet we're strapped for cash. So automation in all its glory, whether we're talking about AI, 5G, digital currency, we're talking about bio sort of innovations, smart manufacturing, supply chain management. There's so many use cases that we're going to be looking at and seeing how in each of these areas, some of these issues can be addressed. So I feel like this is really the heart of it, right? If we wanted to then talk about ethics, what is ethics? And I feel like that's something that's also going to be like, it depends, right? I'm not going to be able to offer one concrete definition. But what I can, with a certain level of confidence, say that ethics is not legal. Ethics is almost like a social or organizational value system. And it's not necessarily what the prevailing law is. It's not, when there are ethics violations, right? That's because there's like either a social contract that has been failed, but it's not because a law per se. Basically, you can never sue somebody unless it was in the clause. Of course, some organizations have much more stricter controls. I do think that ethics is something that it's human beings almost aspiring to higher values beyond what the average social contract is that has been sort of coded into law. So the law is always catching up with ethics. I feel like the law is always below ethics, and ethics is almost that higher standard. And the other clarification I wanted to make that might come up as we discuss automation in general is, again, intelligence is not necessarily superior, right? So just because we create a better machine or a machine that makes hamburgers better than a McDonald's employee, it does not mean that all of a sudden that machine is now superior to that employee, right? So I think the overall challenge here is how do we preserve human value and not make it expendable once machines can do that or replicate that, that human contribution. The part that's still safe for now, perhaps not for long, is the creativity aspect, right? So what is creativity? And I feel like for human beings, we tend to assume that creativity is that aspect where we connect the dots, and maybe a machine is not good at doing that. But that line is also becoming blurry because we're seeing computers become really good at playing games or sort of writing their own software, right? If a machine can write its own software and update itself, is it really gonna need a human being to sort of do that thing, right? So I wanted to sort of explore these foundational concepts so that as we're looking at the challenges on a broader scale, before you even go to deploy something that's going to impact hundreds of thousands of customers, millions of users, what is your value system, right? So the opportunities there are, how do we identify our cultural, human, and digital personas from that identity conversation? Like, who are we serving? Ownership, is this going to be public versus private, right? There's limitations to funding. Conflicts of interest can be addressed here. When we think about access, do you want this product or solution to be exclusive, or do you want it to be inclusive, right? And so in individualized cultures, you're gonna have a pay to play or pay for access kind of model. In communal cultures, maybe if we're looking at emerging markets like Africa, Latin America, the government may back certain solutions so citizens have faster access. If you look at India and how it's had broad scale AI sort of deployment around digital identities, biometrics, and other kind of digital payment solutions. And it is working, but they're looking at it from a communal perspective, not necessarily the individual first model that perhaps the US is moving. Privacy and transparency is obviously included within that access component. And then if we look at design, as far as the implementation, are we going to design digital first, or are we designing from a human perspective first? Because that again determines how the solution comes out at the end. Humanity oftentimes presents complexity, so it's easier to just design with the digital frame of reference. But at the same time, I do think it's worthwhile to integrate those core human values, because otherwise it's not gonna serve the human need. And again, the challenge there is usually because humanity has its limits, right? So even if we could perhaps integrate what we consider our highest values, I talked about trust, I talked maybe some people consider loyalty to be a higher value, especially on the business side. You want loyal customers for that recurring revenue stream. But maybe a computer can figure out a better model for you, right? So machines can actually augment what we have as humans and not necessarily replace everything. The implementation here, again, we're seeing a lot of areas. If you look at how blockchain is coming up and now being augmented or supplemented with automation, you can see this constant struggle between centralized versus decentralized systems, right? Again, traditionally, you come to work, you're using a company computer, security verifies your access to that device. With work from home, which is increasingly becoming the reality, right? it's a bring your own device, right? So you bring your own computer. Security sends you maybe an update or a way to secure your device, but it's not fully centralized per se. That creates more risk, but also creates a sense of flexibility from the workforce. The last piece is really policy. And here policy, I'm looking at it again from the ethical perspective, as well as the legal. And on average, legal is almost, on average, always 10 years behind. So legislation gets passed 10 years after new innovation has come about, right? If you look at 5G, blockchain, and even for AI, AI has been around for a long time, but we still don't have clear guidance for autonomous vehicles and all these other sort of solutions being innovated, right? So having forward-looking ethical policies helps guide innovation, because by the time the law applies, you're most likely to have been compliant. And that's often an advantage as well. So to summarize, you might say, well, I hear a lot about ethics, I'm hearing a lot about policy. What does this mean, or how does this help me from a business point of view? Well, we know a lot of businesses are hurting right now. We know the economy is down, global economy is down. And so organizations are looking to innovate, to adapt, change their business model. And really, the big challenge is whether you're for-profit or non-profit, right? How do you get the most from your people? How do you get the most from your processes, internal and external? How do you streamline your production? Make sure management is being trained to adapt and manage better, to optimize that your assets in terms of their return. And whether we're looking at marketing, if you're gonna really succeed in digital marketing, you're gonna have to maybe have a better algorithm that can filter through tons and tons of metrics of data and find your most likely customer, or find the best way to convince that customer to come back and buy from. But more importantly than all that is your human resource capacity, right? So the more you can train your people to be that bridge between your client or your customer and the data and help make sense of it, the better you can be. So I'm hoping that by the end of the talk, we'll have a better sense of how AI can actually be practically applied to help businesses survive this transition and also come out stronger and more resilient for the industrial revolution. So, real world check. I know we've had a little bit about the ethics side of it. So let's bring this back to the real world. Globally, there's about 1 billion people worldwide with disabilities. And I picked this particular area because it's in some countries, it is policy that technologies must be accessible, right? There's accessibility laws, so you can't really discriminate or make your technology inaccessible to some of these people. But in some countries, as is in most of Africa, not necessarily, right? You could build something and you won't really get into any legal challenges if your solution only serves a certain demographic. But 1 billion people is still a lot, and that's a huge untapped market as organizations look to adapt. And actually, AI can do this. Google is one company that's winning really well here, where with their speech-to-text or text-to-speech automation system, they've been able to localize a lot of their services to Hindu, which is one of the main languages in India. And this has really been complementary to the digital adoption, mobile revolution that's happening in India, making technology accessible to millions in their local language without them having to go learn English first or learn French first. So technology can really bring about the type of positive change, the type of economic change and transformation that businesses need, but also benefit communities. And so I wanted to really start there because that's one clear example on how an ethical innovation can deliver value and capture new market segments, both geographically and demographically, that a business was not able to do before. Another great example of organizations that are doing this really well is Microsoft. Microsoft with the Azure cloud platform has been able to put trust and security at the forefront of their innovation. I'll explain a little later how this really works and how organizations that have traditionally been Microsoft clients have continued to work with Microsoft despite Google and Amazon being innovative in these areas. That's because they put trust at the center of their automation processes around data governance and around sort of the control and decision making that comes with these kind of deployments. And they're doing this through a hybrid model that allows you to keep data on your premise, or you can have a cloud-based model, and as well as supporting what we think is going to be the next generation for automation, which is automation at the edge. And when we mean the edge, we're talking about the mobile devices, your computer, where the processing actually happens on your machine, and the data doesn't have to make round-trip decision to the cloud, to Microsoft or Google, to be able to be analyzed and give you instant insight. So this is the clear model on how understanding, right? Once you have the data, how you're able to understand the insights that are generated. How can we protect the data and make sure that it's secure when we're talking about healthcare data, when we're talking about financial trading data, where you want all traders to have access to the information at the same time, or you don't want your private banking clients' information shared without their permission, right? So data protection at scale becomes a critical need. But more importantly, control. Are you going to automate that control through machine agents, or is that control going to be manually reviewed once in a while through human partners that are able to then decide where the data can live, how it can be interacted with, who has access to it, and how it can be utilized. As I almost come to the end here, let me highlight a few examples of companies that are actually innovating in these spaces. This is a startup called Simpa, SIMPA, and they're really all about personalized healthcare. The original story here is that how do you use data or insight from your daily health lifestyle, whether it's the amount of exercise you're having, the type of nutrition you're undertaking, to then be able to generate personalized recommendations based on your medical history, among other metrics on how you can perhaps stay on track with your prescription, or have better therapy so you can recover faster, or develop your immune system so you don't get reinfected again. This is something that I think actually it captures all some of the core use cases around healthcare innovation, but as well presents the conflict or dilemma around the issue of data privacy. So where is all this data going? Would we trust it with one organization? And how are the private company to bank, to medical facility kind of relationships? If I ever then need to share this with my doctor, how would I be able to do it, right? So the level of scoping and perhaps business analysis and perhaps compliance involved in this is definitely what scrutiny, but nonetheless, happy to see innovations like this on the market. Another quick example around financial innovation is Skybit, and Skybit is really looking at financial inclusion. So I mentioned earlier the issue around untapped or unaccessible markets right now, whether we're talking about the accessibility side, but we can also look at policy. There are regions in the world where, due to the way international finance or banking laws operate right now, whether it's Myanmar, whether it's, if you're in Africa, for example, you may not directly be approved for a PayPal bank account, right? So the financial freedom that perhaps the Western markets enjoy is currently not yet accessible to some regions or parts of the world. And blockchain is actually helping address that need, but not just on the back end level. They're bringing through digital wallets or applications on your phone that can allow you to track your balance, get notifications, deposit, make payments, allowing consumers to now be fully integrated into a global digital economy where you can trade and do business beyond borders without ever leaving your hometown. And automation is a big part of this whole process where currency can be converted in milliseconds between the US dollar and the Myanmar card, between the US dollar and perhaps the Canadian dollar. The average business person doesn't need to worry about these conversion rates because the software can do it for them. And again, because they trust, hopefully, that brand, or because they trust that service, they are able to do that business. Another quick example that is perhaps one of my favorite is this trading example, where this, the screenshot you see on the left and the right as well, is for this fund manager that's really trying to create the perfect automated trading algorithm, right? So he can perhaps sleep more, play golf more, while the software is making more money for him. He's yet to get there, obviously, and there's rumors that he's reporting more success than is real, but statistically, robot-powered sort of auto trading is generating more returns than traditional investment managers, fund managers. So we're already seeing automation deliver results in the financial trading space. We're seeing it in banking with organizations like Visa filing for a cryptocurrency system to kind of replace its current system. And we'll continue to see these changes. So whether you're in banking, whether you're in healthcare, or whether we're in this sort of health crisis right now with robots being deployed to sort of help monitor and perhaps contain the spread of COVID-19 through automatic sensing, the issue of trust, the issue of data privacy and the breach, or perhaps mass surveillance, as the concern with China and other areas, still stays consistent. And so this brings us back to ethics, because it does matter what the core belief is in a society or in a system for these things to really be of priority, right? If you're looking at it from a communal perspective, then data sharing is okay. If you're looking at it from an individualized economy, then my personal data is my personal data. There's another complexity if you look at European law, GDPR privacy laws versus the US laws, right? In Europe, private or personal information is actually protected. And we're seeing states like California in the US begin to enact, as well as of last year, very strict privacy laws. So as an organization, understanding if you have clients in these regions and how you're going to be compliant is critical before you just build out an all-out solution. I did mention, and I'm winding down here, so again, just bringing back to how this ties back to the consumer, to banking, to innovation, practical innovation, as far as implementing automated systems. We're looking at the continued growth of blockchain to the point where the US government is debating having a digital dollar. We're seeing China aggressively back blockchain. We're seeing a lot of innovation in terms of mobile wallet, as I mentioned, point of sale systems, the kind of Square or your traditional debit card readers that are now going to be reading crypto or blockchain enabled devices. All these are being powered by the highest sort of cryptography, the highest for security, the highest automation to deliver that real-time service model that the consumer is already used to with their Visa card. So we don't want this solution to just be less than what the user already knows. And I just feel like this collaboration between the technical and the design side and the compliance side is just one way on how you can do automation right. I think my last example is this startup again company. I decided to go with startups, not corporations, because I thought, well, we're going to have maybe an audience that's 50% people in corporate. Might as well show them the other side of where the innovation is happening as well. So this particular company is automating buyer-seller matching for policyholders in particular annuities, where people have to withdraw their retirement funds or sell their rights to reimbursements after maybe they've won a lawsuit or other things. And traditionally, you have to wait 3 to 6 months to get a judge to offer you an approval. Then you take that to the court or some other system, right? A lot of paper-based processing that they can be able to bring online, and really, instead of waiting months, they're bringing this process down to a number of days, because once you create your profile, they can easily now match the policy holders with the investors and the sellers and be able to do this seamlessly. So some of the points that I want to end with before I take some questions, and hopefully I haven't really gotten over the time limit, is Einstein, who I greatly admire, once said that imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, right? There's a limit to what we can know and understand, right? So the difference here is imagination kind of embraces the whole world. And so there's always going to be things we don't know, which brings me back to that fundamental question, right? What is the limit? Are we modeling our artificial intelligence after human beings because we are the smartest species in the universe or in the galaxy? Or are we going to admit that humanity has a limit, that we don't always make the right decisions, right? If you think world war, if you think continued racial tensions in the world, if you think all these limitations human beings have in making decisions, how do we then accept that reality and look at software and look at automation as an argument to do better the things perhaps we can do well, and not look at it as something that's here to replace us, but rather look at it as a partner and as a complement. And I feel like the way to go about this is to start with identifying what those shared human values are, which is a very difficult process, and I don't think we've been able to do that really well. So once we agree on what those fundamental human values are, we can then codify them into the software we design and build, and be able to monitor that from time to time, making improvements ever so slightly as needed to make sure we're progressing, but in an ethical way, and not just building things that we go to bed worrying they might kill us because we didn't really design them the right way. So to sort of wrap up again, I think having shared human values, starting with humanity as the baseline, and then iterating with artificial general intelligence to sort of complement those shared values to a point where we can enforce those values that are good, with the end goal for trust, right? So this is Chris Roger. I'm just gonna end with this note. He goes, it's always best to shine the spotlight on the right behavior than to criticize the wrong behavior. And I really think this is important in innovation because a lot can go wrong. We may have a lot of concerns, but what if we focused on what could go well? What if we focused on the things we want to get right? So that as an organization, as an institution, as a government, we're able to prioritize those things. Whether it's better financial service delivery, whether it's increased productivity, cost savings, increased revenue generation, you name it. I think there's a lot of potential, and I'm gonna stop here and take some questions.
It's wonderful. Thanks, Brian. So if anyone has any questions, raise your hand or go ahead and right, okay, just looking at the screen here. Right, okay, Brian, thanks for that. I do have a question for you. Thanks for that very insightful presentation. You touched on a topic, I think, which resonates with me, and I'm pretty sure pretty much anyone who's been following innovation over the past 10, 20 years, and is also looking for areas for improvement at the ethical level. Particularly, you pointed out there is this need for, or at least there's a decision point, right? Do we continue to design solutions that are digital first? Or do we start looking at designing solutions that are human first? And I think it's probably one of the first times I've really had a really deep think about it and what that actually, what's the implications of that. I'd like to get your perspectives. Is it something that you think will happen through government regulation? Do you think perhaps tech companies will continue to innovate and provide ethical first tools, build guardrails into their platforms? Or are we going to have to rely on communities actually making the empowering decisions to say, okay, we're going to build a blockchain that we actually incorporate automation that enables us to have trust built into the actual platform. So when we interact, when we transact, it's actually built into the platform, and hence, you have those guardrails built in. Is there a combination of those two, or do you see something kind of taking a mirror?
Thanks for the question. I'm going to say that it depends, as I've always been taught. I guess it's going to be a hybrid of everything, depending on the circumstances. But let's talk about where we are right now, right? Where we're coming from is always government decided 10 years. So if you're in America, it doesn't really matter. You can always innovate. The law can catch up to you. If you're in Europe, the law comes first, right? So European innovation is actually more conservative. Even if you look at the history of the railway line innovation, the bicycle, like any tool that we've ever created, right? If you're coming from a society that's more conservative, and conservative, I don't mean it in a sort of a political sense. I'm talking about, do we take human safety seriously? Do we consider it higher than perhaps the prestige of just innovating for the sake of innovating? Because if you look at genetically modified foods, not very supportive in Europe, right? But if you look at the US, where the corporation has a variety of rights, I mean, the corporation is a person, right? So there's really very little regulation that's in the way for companies, I think, until you get to a point where, as I say, you now want to bring this, if you think smart cities, you now want to deploy this in the whole of New York City and manage the entire subway system. And God forbid, somebody's Metro card did not work, and now they can't get to work because your system or your algorithm said their subway card was not valid, but maybe it was, right? So until you're in a place where you're creating what I consider, I guess, scalable or felt human damage, right? Like you're at the point where you're going to get backlash. That's when I think the US government gets involved and says, okay, now this is a public, issue. We can't have automated Tesla cars going and knocking around people without consequences. Let's look at it, right? But up until that point, up until the first Tesla has an accident, there is no regulation, right? So it depends on the geographical location as well as the historical trend of how innovation has been regulated in these regions. But to answer the quick question of digital first versus human first, personally, I want to go human first because, right, digital, we're just innovating, right? So I do fundamentally believe that technology is a tool to help us do something better that we were already going to do as human beings, and better towards what goal, right? So the current trend that's coming around, and this is what you asked as far as where we're going, the short answer is this concept called DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization. It's basically an organization, as you mentioned, where a community comes together and decides what the rules are going to be for that organization. And so from the inception, the organization is digital. The rules are digitized through smart contracts. So even how do you become a member? Well, we will code those rules on how you become a member, and we will check if you meet those requirements before you become a member. But here's the nice thing, some of the members or some of the decision makers of that organization including the workers or the admin, are automated agents, right? So you can participate as a human being, but you're not necessary to the survival of this automated organization. And we're seeing countries actually deploy this at scale. Where, if you look at Estonia, Estonia has its digital citizenship program, where anybody from anywhere, can apply to be a digital citizen, be able to do business in Estonia, pay taxes, and do all these other things that a citizen would do, except maybe voting. But you could vote digitally on perhaps issues that affect the digital economy sort of concept. So I think we're beginning to see this in practice. Taiwan, I met the digital minister for Taiwan I think 2 years ago in New York at a conference, and he was able to explain this concept of e-governance to me, where he's managed to also spearhead this, where it started as a public, you can think of it as a hacktivist kind of culture, where they started hacking open source tools to display government budgets, right? How do you make sure public budgeting decisions are available publicly and not made in a secret room and nobody ever knows how government funds are spent? These tools became so popular and people were voting on how they wanted funds spent in their community that the government just decided to adopt them and sort of normalize them so that they could help the government function better. And it's been a huge success. So I think innovation happens in all places. I can't predict where it will come from, but smart governments will adapt, smart cities or smart mayors will adapt so they can form smart cities. And obviously smart executives will hopefully invest in the automation and the people training so that their organizations can adapt and deliver these solutions. I don't know if that answered the conversation, the question you asked, but I think it comes back to values, right? What values do we want to enforce in the technology we're building? And that's always the trend, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, that was exactly, I think you absolutely nailed it on the head. I was very keen to see different perspectives, and I think you've highlighted what I suspect is the case, that it's going to take a hybrid approach, particularly around blockchain, which is a topic of great interest to me, and I think that there's certainly some solutions there. I'm just wondering if anyone else had any questions, because I do have another question, which also I'd like to get Michael's input on as well. Any other questions out there?
Debbie, did I touch on, I know I didn't really specifically address your question, but do you feel like you've gotten some of your earlier questions answered, or if so, do you have any follow-up?
Actually, what you touched on was even better as far as I'm concerned, because it gave a lot of things for considerations for people to be thinking of. And the hybrid model, I agree with Dennis, it's awesome.
Thank you. Permission to use your feedback.
Great.
So Dennis, you might go ahead and perhaps other people will be thinking in the meantime. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So, and Michael, I'd like to get your input on this one, and then maybe Brian, you can also butt in as well. So you talked about the fourth industrial revolution, and we know that that's very much driving a lot of what we're seeing right now. What's really interesting is some of the items that Brian touched on, which is that convergence of AI, machine learning, and blockchain all coming together to create these amazing opportunities. And I guess it comes down to really how we strike the right balance between driving innovation, making sure that we're not throttling the endless possibilities that exist out there, while at the same time being cognizant of the ethical challenges that might arise. So you talk about, we see how, for example, technology is being used for things like contact tracing. In some jurisdictions, very successfully. In some jurisdictions, there are major question marks. But that data also has opportunities for being misused. You have situations where, for example, we know the young lady who managed to take their video recording of the police officer on the George Floyd situation, provides through technology of mobile and social media, is able to propagate that across the world, and so, the truth ultimately comes out because of technology. But then how do we actually make sure we continue to drive innovation without letting those opportunities get missed, to actually use it in the right way? Is there a right way to balance it? Or is it pretty much the case of let's just continue to move forward and hope that people just do the right thing, organizations do the right thing.
Michael, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll just say that, I don't think that we can take a laissez-faire approach. Certainly, you don't want to get in the way of innovation, but, we have to think of government as an extension of the will of the people. And so we need, the people represented by government, and we also need businesses themselves to come together and really contemplate what these ethical issues are and make sure that ethics are baked in to these efforts from the beginning. Right? Like, for example, one of the things that struck me about Brian's presentation was that discussion of people with disabilities. I was talking about this digital ecosystem that we're trying to create, tying in all the different stakeholders, but that assumes, right, that people have access to this digital economy. What about people from disadvantaged environments that don't even have an internet connection? How do you deliver these amazing services to people who aren't even able to plug into the digital economy? Or, in the case of contact tracing or COVID-19, certainly a machine that could read me and ensure that I am not exhibiting symptoms or showing a temperature that would allow me to go into a shared space. I mean, obviously, that's an amazing technological breakthrough. But what else could that machine tell about the current state of my health? And who's going to make sure that that information about my health is protected? So, I don't want to stand in the way of that kind of innovation to deal with the very unique challenges presented by COVID-19, but it's incumbent upon the corporations that are developing this technology to not just develop it because they can and because it would be extremely profitable to do so, but to think about at the design stage, well, what are the implications for this data and how are we going to protect it? And how are we going to make sure that it's used for good rather than ill? And so, we don't want to regulate from the top down necessarily from governments, but we do want to ensure that there's a partnership so that the people who are responsible for developing these technologies are using it to lift all of mankind. Rather than only the people who have access to these technologies or only the people who have control of the data. I mean, I had talked about 5 companies of the 20th century that now comprise 5 of the top 10. The other 2 out of those 7 are Apple and Microsoft. All right, so how did Microsoft get on that list? I mean, they sell operating systems, right? No. Microsoft with Azure is in the data business. I mean, why did they buy LinkedIn? I mean, Facebook is one of those top 5. LinkedIn is the business version of Facebook. It's about data. Microsoft's a data company, right? Same thing with Apple, right? Apple is not a manufacturer of computers. Apple's a data company now. And so what we want to make sure is that these companies that control this massive amount of data, that they're using it to create access to technology for everyone rather than owning and hoarding that data so that only they can deliver services on platforms that they control. It's an extraordinarily thorny ethical dilemma, and we all have to work together to make sure that these ethical dilemmas are resolved in a way that does the greatest good to humanity.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think, if it's not somehow measured, controlled, there is always that possibility that the transfer of wealth is going to continue in a certain direction, and you won't get beneficiaries around the world. And so, Brian, did you want to comment on that point as well?
Yeah, I'll be quick since you kind of covered a lot of it. I would say to sort of contextualize it in the current debate, I think the quick example that we see of that is a company like Twitter enforcing, right, sort of tweet fact checking versus Facebook that's allowing sort of false information to continue to spread at scale. And that's a clear difference between leadership between 2 organizations. Now, again, I don't want to say, I think they're both following the law, but one is perhaps trying to take a higher ethical standard. from their perspective, right? Again, ethics is sort of, it's not, ethics is not like a fixed conversation. Like I said, we are yet to globally agree on what the rules of the game are. But that clearly is already beginning to show a big difference in terms of where technology is going. Where Twitter can say, oh, we're going to put human safety and all these other concerns first. And Facebook is like, it's fair game. People are allowed to say what they can, and we will let human beings decide what's truthful or not, right? Regardless of what the algorithm is doing. And I want to add like one last point there is a quick example too around, is there a right way to do it? I'm going to say probably not, right? We'll go back to that hybrid model of companies will continue to innovate, but society, it's society's responsibility to hold innovators accountable, because without that oversight, then we fail humanity. A quick example is how OpenAI, which was funded by Elon Musk from Tesla as a nonprofit focused on open artificial intelligence to benefit the common humanity, has recently pivoted to becoming for-profit, so it can aggressively pursue AI innovation. And they still promise that their technology will benefit everybody. But I feel like that's a very thin line that they're walking, because why didn't they stay as a nonprofit? Why are they then going commercial? So I think the issue of funding, where funding comes from for innovation, will always perhaps favor the for-profit route. But open source and community innovations are still also increasing. So I think we'll have both, and perhaps it's the user in terms of what technologies they use that can impact what technology succeeds.
Great points, yes. And I think just to tie it back to Michael's earlier point around data being the real asset here, I like to think, and I hope, maybe I'm being over-optimistic, but whoever owns that data is one thing, but ultimately it's who can actually engender trust with that data. Hopefully that's where we're going to see real success, and it's not necessarily going to be, purely focused around the profit motive. So hopefully we start to combine both data ownership and also insist that, yes, there has to be trust, and whoever can demonstrate the most trust, and you had a great example of Twitter there, hopefully that's where the winners are going to come from. Okay, well, thank you very much. We're actually bang on time. A big thanks to Michael and Brian for wonderful presentations. If you want copies of their presentation decks, you've got Michael's email. You've also got Brian's email, but I'm going to be sending it to the meetup groups as well. So rest assured, you'll get a copy if you want it. And also follow us on LinkedIn, and there's going to be some other social media follow-ups on this as well. So thanks everyone for joining. And Michael and Brian, last quick words for you, please.
I'll just say that, if you, not that I'm a historical expert on this, but if you look at the printing press, that was a technology that truly changed the world, democratized the spread of information. And now you have platforms like Facebook and Twitter doing the same thing, for good and for ill. And so these are issues with which we've grappled throughout history. But it's just the change is happening at such an accelerated rate now that it becomes very, very important for us to really understand what we're doing with technology and make sure that we're keeping a good control over its impact on society. And thank you very much, Dennis, for the opportunity today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this great group.
Thanks, Michael.
Look at sort of the ethics and values being the guiding principles of all these decisions, it's actually a little bit easier and manageable, because the values are often smaller, right? You can't be a company with 10 values. It often comes down to 3 or 4 main ones that you really believe in fundamentally. And I feel like that will continue to be the guiding point. I want to get to a point where perhaps in the future, before you interact with a brand or before you even work for a company, right on their homepage, they're able to show you what their core values are. And hopefully then you can research if there's a history of them complying with those values. But I do think that that's sort of the only way to sort of have some sort of guidance, some kind of ethical guidance as people are innovating or partnering or developing new solutions. And so the guidelines there are being concerned, always being concerned around issues of identity and access, ownership, trust, and then scale. And I think as we navigate these opportunities, which there are many, if we put ethics and values first, there's likelihood of coming up on top long term once the regulations come in.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Okay, thanks everyone. So there end of the event. Stay connected and look forward to hearing from you and attending future events. Thank you, everyone.